James, I want to talk to you about something. Me and you talk a lot, but we are both of the LGBTQ plus community, and I want to talk about blackness in the LGBTQ plus community because that is a conversation that, a lot of people who move through the world that are black and are LGBTQ plus have different opinions, have a difference of opinion on what that means and what that represents. I want to get your take on that because you are biracial, and with that comes a whole layer of complexities that maybe someone like myself who is not biracial and who is of a darker complexion doesn't have to deal with or hasn't had to grapple with. For yourself, what has that been?
I mean, wow, that's a lot. There's so much that we could unpack there, particularly in terms of colorism in our community as well, and the privilege and the passing that I am afforded, right? It's really interesting how many people do not assume my blackness, right? Black folks always know. White people always assume I'm a white person with a tan. It's very interesting. But something about my being biracial, growing up in Nebraska, having half of me understanding sort of like white culture, white Midwest Protestant culture, there is a lot of privilege to that. And it's really interesting as this relates to sort of the LGBTQ community. So you add in those different layers, right, that I talked about in terms of being biracial and then coming out as gay. And even, subsequently after that, really, I more identify now as queer. And there's always this challenge that happens, I think, a lot that a lot of folks of color who are also queer or part of the LGBT community really face. And that is representing your community, both of them, right? So is this a Black issue? Is this a queer issue? Is this a Black queer issue? And if you are championing one cause, are you then subsequently not championing another cause, right? So if you are championing a cause for queerness, a cause for, advancing gay rights like marriage, for instance, before marriage was legal, does that mean you're then putting the racial disparities and the things we need to keep working on as a community from that sense second, right?
Right.
And that's a challenge that I think a lot of people don't necessarily think about, that we are complex human beings. We have a complex society, and we come from so many different places, and that multiple truths can exist simultaneously. But at the same time, it is incredibly unique to have the systemic oppression on your race, as well as the systemic oppression upon your socioeconomic status, as
Right.
well as on your sexuality. And the intersections of all of those are really, really tremendously complicated for a lot of people.
They are absolutely tremendously complicated for a lot of people, and I mean, it's such a unique perspective you so eloquently articulated because for myself, I am, as I said earlier, I am not biracial. I am to the world Black, really very Black. But on the flip side of that, James, I think when it comes to Blackness in the LGBTQ plus community, there also becomes a conversation of homophobia. Going all the way back to slave days, how slave masters would question and would challenge a Black man's masculinity as being men. Not to enter toxic masculinity into the conversation, but let's go back 100, 200 years when the essence of who you were, because you had been stripped of everything else, your name, your legacy, your history, all you had was who you were as a man and your masculinity. That was put into question and also challenged by other men, by the slave master, right? So, it's this generational thing that's been passed down that about what gay represents, right? What that attraction represents. And it's even in 2021 and the generation that we're in, we've seen strides and we have conversations about erasing that and eradicating that out of the community, but it's become more sinister, it's become more covert, at least to me. I can only speak for myself and my experience. But I think now more than ever, or I would imagine that the conversation is more accepting. I have family members who are clergymen, who are pastors and deacons at major AME churches in major Black metropolitan areas that even now still have a tinge of that, we're not ready to go there yet. We know it's there, but we don't speak about it. It's like, you have the LGBTQ plus uncle who is gay, but you don't talk about it, which is still sad.
Of course.
It's still one of those things that's like, well, why are we not talking about this? Because especially in 2020, we saw the unearthing of racial violence, and violence against our trans community, which we're going to talk about as well. Also, rioting, a pandemic. There were so many things that were, as I like to say, traumatic, because let's keep it 100% and all the way real. 2020 was a very traumatic a year for a myriad of different reasons, much like the ones I just illustrated. So I just find it fascinating that we're still shying away from the LGBTQ plus conversation in the Black community, in some sectors and in some sections of our community.
And I think that, shying away from that conversation, Jason, is something that happens because, and I'm going to derail us for just a moment here, but I think I'll bring you back full circle. I promise we'll have an Oprah moment with this, that, the misogyny that is so incredibly deep and ingrained in what was taught to us from slavery, right? Mm-hmm. There are so many, even if you go back into the sub-Saharan, African diaspora in West Africa, there were so many tribal nations that actually revered and understood that there is more than one gender. Revered, just like a lot of indigenous American tribes here, actually revered individuals who had a more fluid sexuality. Yes. and held them up in religious, aspects. And then those, we get brought here against our will, put into slavery, taught Christianity, and then all of a sudden there's something wrong with those things. And then you add the level of misogyny onto it, right? Because let's be real, if we're going to be real about this, part of the reason that it is a challenge, it is difficult for a lot of, unfortunately, men in general, and has been in the Black community, though that's a whole conversation, is acting gay is like acting like a woman. And that equals bad, right? So it's the ingrained misogyny in there that was unfortunately taught to us as combine all of us together as a race since slavery, and that perpetuates now. What I do think is really fantastic, though, not to continue to harp on the history, is that we're making such incredible strides. Sure. I think that there are tremendous examples right now. I know there are incredible examples now of this sort of tired narrative of the hyper-masculine Black man.
The mystique, the Black mystique, right?
Yes, as sort of an anti-gay figure, right? And this masculine, muscular, et cetera, and that can also not be gay. And it's really interesting that that's starting to fade away now, and it is coming because of political activism. It is coming because of ball culture. It is coming because of athletes who have come out who happen to be Black. The entire, like we often do as a Black community, and we tend to lead that in some ways, lead the acceptance of more gender fluidity, more sexual fluidity as a community. And so, I don't necessarily buy any more into that narrative of, the Black community as a whole is less accepting of LGBTQ folks. I think that's something that's a narrative that we like to preach and talk about. When you really get down to the nitty gritty and the narrative of it, on an individual basis, it's changing. And I think that's a positive that we really have to hang on to.